Welcome to Nuclear Matters from the Australian National University College of Systems and Society. I'm your host, Liz Williams, a nuclear physicist and nuclear systems discipline lead for the ANU School of Engineering. In this episode, we explore how education in nuclear science can serve as a bridge between nations. I've invited Dr. A.J. Mitchell, an experimental nuclear physicist here at the ANU, to help us with this exploration. AJ's journey into international nuclear education began with a simple email, an unexpected opportunity that led to meaningful collaborations with Myanmar and Cambodia that supported nuclear research and education in contexts very different from his own. Let's listen in. Thank you, AJ, for joining me today. I really appreciate this. I wanted to talk to you about your work on nuclear education for developing contexts. And the reason I wanted to talk to you about that is because that is something that Australia is actively involved in and is something that we do as a way to connect with neighboring nations, etc. When did you first start thinking about how to develop nuclear education for these contexts?
I just arrived at ANU and this email appeared one day. It basically said that there was a group within the College of Asia and Pacific that had a little bit of money left over from a big program they had sponsored by DFAT. They were looking into ways that they could expand either research or education capabilities, connecting ANU and Myanmar. And they said, anybody who's interested, basically put your hand up and let's have a chat about it. So I saw that and thought, oh, here's an opportunity. I've never been to Southeast Asia. What's going on there? You know, let's just have a look into this. And it turned out from the limited information you could get on the university's website, Yangon University's website, where they seem to have expertise in nuclear physics. Mm-hmm. They had existing partnerships with the International Atomic Energy Agency. They had all this equipment listed that I was going through that list and thinking, yeah, we have that in our teaching lab. We have that in our teaching lab. But of course, you know, no contact details anywhere. Longer story short, the College of Asia Pacific agreed to fund a couple of reciprocal visits. They got in touch with the University of Yangon Physics Department, who wrote back enthusiastically saying that, you know, this would be great. Yeah, let's give it a go. Something that turned out to be a really interesting, fulfilling endeavor for me, I say, just off the back of a single email that many people would have just deleted and moved on.
Tell me a little bit more about what they're doing at Yangon in nuclear physics. Does that support research? Does that support applications in Myanmar? Like, what does that educational experience support?
Yeah, so, this was one of the culture shock's not quite the right word, but the removal from what my expectation was. I say I'd read what I read on the internet that talked about all this capability, especially around nuclear training and research. Eventually, I got in touch with the staff in Yangon, and initially they just said, you know, come, we'll see. It'll all be fine. It'll all be great. So I put a little bit of faith in that and just, you know, jumped on the plane and went there. And in terms of, you know, the whole educational experience, I spent some time working in their teaching lab, and they were running many of the types of the small experiments that we do in our lab that you'd be familiar with, about, you know, counting different types of radiation with sodium iodide detectors, looking at the energy loss of different types of radiation passing through materials, because that's important from radiation shielding perspective, as you know. But I think the kickback here had been a legacy of a project that had been funded in the 90s by the IAEA,
International Atomic Energy Agency.
That's right. Yeah, there's technical corporation projects, these TC projects as they refer to them. Mm-hmm. It's all about capacity building. Yeah. And this investment had been made in Myanmar in the 90s, probably without the long-term strategic thinking that it needed. Yeah. So one of the most important pieces of research equipment in that lab was this high-purity germanium detector, mm-hmm. with this massive dewar for liquid nitrogen. And I don't know the details, but you could tell that this hadn't been run for a long time, because there was this initial investment, but to operate these types of detectors, you need to fill these detectors with liquid nitrogen every couple of days, and that just hadn't been supported. But again, I think the initial goal would have been really connected to the strengths of the university, and they had a really strong materials research program. Mm-hmm. I think part of that initial investment was to try and uplift sort of that materials research with nuclear techniques. And I think over time, those two areas just sort of drifted apart. Now, they had a renewed interest in radon mapping. So radon, this radioactive gas that can be pretty hazardous if it accumulates in basements and rooms that aren't ventilated, so on and so forth. There just aren't there's no data points across Myanmar for that.
Maybe we should take a step back and talk about, how radon gas is produced and where it tends to be found, and why it's important to do that kind of mapping.
It's a radioactive gas that's produced as part of the decay chains of uranium and thorium. These materials that appear naturally in the ground, and even if you start off with uranium nucleus, it will decay and decay and decay and decay over very, very long time scales, eventually back to stability. But as one of the steps in that long process, you have this gas that's produced, and gases are highly mobile when they're formed. And if you have that gas leaching out of the soil into, say, basements or rooms that aren't well ventilated, it can accumulate. And the thing about those gases are that they're radioactive themselves. They emit alpha particles that ordinarily, if they're outside of the body, an external dose to those alpha particles is in many cases, in most cases, isn't dangerous. But if you inhale that gas and it's undergoing that alpha decay, that radioactive decay within your lungs, then that can be pretty bad from a health perspective. So understanding where these gases exist and where they move around, really important from a human health perspective. And I say many areas are pretty well mapped out, but I don't think there was a single data point for the entire Myanmar country. So this was something that when they were looking at their nuclear expertise, or where it was at, or things that they could be pursuing research in, investigating or conducting an extensive radon map was something that was talked about.
Yeah. Going back to these International Atomic Energy Agency technical cooperation agreements, can you tell me a little bit about what those are usually meant to support?
They are, to the best of my knowledge, they are primarily around uplifting education in developing countries. Mm-hmm. And Myanmar was a great example of that. But this is an ongoing thing. I think it's a global initiative, not just focused in Southeast Asia, but all across the world. And it's something that Australia has existing and ongoing connections with. From my own experience, because of the work that we did in Myanmar, an opportunity came up a few years later, connecting academics in Cambodia at the Royal University of Phnom Penh with ANU. And again, the general theme, the focus of these TC projects was around developing capability, capacity in nuclear training. And with this particular university, there was a program initiated to fund the development of a new nuclear teaching lab to provide equipment, standard nuclear instrumentation, detectors, but also the paperwork, the policies, the practice around handling and purchasing radioactive sources, but then also for training the trainers as well.
It's probably worth noting, maybe at this point, that this work is really about supporting peaceful uses of nuclear technologies in these countries. Like that's basically IAEA's thing, right?
Yeah.
And so the kinds of training that you're talking about would support things like the use of radiation and medical treatments, environmental monitoring, all of those kinds of things, right?
That's right. And those two are the go-to examples. Whenever we discuss things like this, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of people in Australia every year benefit from radiation-based diagnostics in health, treatments as well. Of course, Australia is not the only country that has that capability, and this is one of the things. If we're looking at trying to improve overall quality of life, health applications of nuclear technology and science is a really, really important one there. But I think as well as you mentioned that environmental monitoring, I think for a lot of the people that I've spoken to, that's a really important aspect. And with the Cambodian delegation that came to visit ANU as part of this program, we talked about environmental monitoring and the capability that we have at the Heavy Ion Accelerator facility around essentially that, with this technique that has unimaginable sensitivity in terms of the species of atoms that it can detect and quantify, and use that for all kinds of environmental monitoring. They were really interested in that.
Okay. And are any of these connected with, for instance, nuclear energy, pursuit of nuclear energy? I'm asking simply because there is a renewed interest in various parts of the globe at the moment due to climate change. We saw an increase in interest in pursuing nuclear energy. And I know, for instance, Myanmar had been talking about a reactor at some point. Do you know if that is part of what the IAEA is aiming to
Yeah,
support?
look, you're absolutely right that we are seeing globally. I mean, if you look at where new reactors are being built, a large fraction of those certainly across Asia and in areas that wouldn't necessarily have considered nuclear an option in decades gone past. But in terms of the projects that I've been involved with, it's not something that has been discussed openly or as part of the priority. It really has been from a fundamental, let's just uplift that general nuclear literacy, the sorts of things that we're hearing more in Australia these last few years, with some hints of connection with existing areas of expertise. But yeah, primarily around that materials, health, environmental monitoring, those things that we've discussed already today.
I know you designed some experiments for the students you were engaging with in Myanmar, and you were discussing that for the project with Cambodia as well. I was wondering if you could talk about the kinds of experiments you had your students do, or the kind of experiments that you designed, and whether you needed to take a different approach at all with regards to your educational design process for these contexts.
Absolutely. So the low-lying fruit, as you would call it, take a standardized, calibrated radioactive source and put it in front of a detector. They were pretty well across all of that sort of thing. So I thought that they would have the biggest gains in terms of either advancing their understanding of doing data analysis or modeling. Mm-hmm. But with this brought computational challenges, things like not having reliable internet access to download anything that was needed, to be able to even have the electricity on to turn the computers on in the first place. All these things that we take for granted here teaching in universities in Australia, just makes you appreciate how fortunate we are, but also really made me notice how resilient the people were, especially in Myanmar, how flexible, how adaptable they are. And we saw that regularly. There would barely be a day when I was there the first time anyway, that the power was there continuously. And they always found a workaround or had some suggestion. It was like, okay, this hasn't happened, rather than, focusing on that, say, okay, all right, let's move on to the next thing, or what else can we do? Or how can we try and do something different? Can you, you've got some notes or whatever, can you explain, can you walk us through, do a few back of the envelope calculations kind of thing? Yeah. And again, one of the surprises that I had, I was expecting to go there and to give a few presentations thinking about the work that we do. And on day one, I arrived at the university. I walked in. Of course, there was a huge group of people stood by the entrance waiting for me. They showed me through to the head of the physics department. And we sat down, and within about 30 seconds, she said, "Oh, it's wonderful, really great to see you. Your first lecture will start in about 10 minutes. We've invited all these academics from the universities across the rest of the city, and we've got all of our postgrad students. I've told them they all have to be here, so they're here."
Welcome.
So, all right. And so me frantically working through different scenarios in my head, managed to get in front of a classroom with a laptop that connected to a projector, and eventually got things up on a slide, and somehow stumbled my way through the first day anyway. And then they said, "Great, so we'll continue tomorrow." Thankfully, because I had the experience of teaching in Australia, I had a lot of material in the bank to set myself up with. It was just, needed some fine tuning to put it in a different context. But then on the third or fourth day, I was getting on top of all this, and this was all fine. And then these three students came walking into a room where I was having a meeting again with the head of the department, and they said it would give them great pleasure if I would be the external examiner for their PhD theses that were being defended next week.
Oh.
I then had 3 theses to read in material science in areas that I had no expertise in. But I felt like in the end, in the defense, I was able to contribute more about the, how you structure a thesis, how you go about data analysis and interpretation, and that have that really critical mindset that we try to train all of our students here, not just taking things for granted, understanding how our measurements and theories are limited in the ways that they are, and how to appreciate uncertainties, all those things that my students would probably go crazy listening to this. But again, it is really, really important.
You were talking about trying to set up research projects that students from Myanmar could engage in, possibly with collaborations here. I'm wondering if you can give me a sense of, first of all, what do their PhD programs look like compared to ours? Like, you're talking about PhD level projects, right?
Yeah, that was what we had talked about initially. But what do the programs look like? That's a great question. That I saw the end product. In terms of timescales, I believe that it's similar, that 3-4 years. But what does the day-to-day look like? What are the nitty-gritty? The theses that I read certainly involved establishing a problem and trying to tackle it through a series of measurements and some simulation, and seeing where the gaps emerge between the two and trying to explain that. So in many ways, the PhD thesis from Yangon University had all the ingredients of a PhD thesis that we'd have from the ANU.
And so in terms of what the collaborations could potentially look like, obviously you're talking about having people potentially come here for research, et cetera. What were the areas of interest, at least that you could tell from what the students wanted to do?
It wasn't being driven so much by the students. This was really from the academic leadership and the people who I was spending most of the time talking about this, where they were really, really focused on the radon mapping. That was something that they had identified as a priority for them as a country, and that they thought that as a prominent university in a prominent city in the country, that they could contribute to that. So we didn't quite know how that project could extend to include international collaboration. They had some tentative plans around, applying for funding through this technical cooperation projects from the International Atomic Energy Agency, and acquiring devices to do monitoring. But beyond that, taking individual samples, whether that was just, say, I put a detector in a place and count for whatever length of time, or somehow taking samples that could then be, applied in some sort of gamma ray spectroscopy technique or whatever. But we didn't really get to the details of that. But I think with many of the universities in Yangon and beyond, and Myanmar, there's pretty high turnover in staff as well, and turnover in terms of movement between the universities. So they tend to stay within academia, but they move around. It's where opportunities are, where the government has requested them. I think it was harder to see where a project like that would gain the traction and momentum over a many-year period to keep things going. But as I say, that came at a time where there was it was a very different political climate as well, so things changed dramatically in Myanmar a couple of years after I'd been there.
When you were there, what was the hierarchy like, and what was the connection between government and research? Do you have a sense of that?
Not really between the government beyond, and I think there was very much a strong hierarchy that came through. The head of the department, the physics department, was the boss, and if she said jump, everybody said, okay, hi. Like it was an immediate response to that.
Yeah.
But they had a structure that worked really, really well for them, I thought. It was an interesting way to work. Compared to the chaos that we see in the Australian universities, in terms of, and chaos in terms of how a day is structured. There's so many different things. I'm jumping from one task to another, to another, to another. There seemed to be a pretty good chain of command and distribution of tasks. And there were lots and lots. The thing that I couldn't get over was how many people there were around there. Like their department had so many people just walking in the corridors, waiting for whatever task to be assigned to them, and things got done, and there was very little question about it. All those people as well made me feel like the most welcome person on the entire planet. Yeah, it was definitely a very different workplace. But in terms of the, you compare how we do things in Australia to how they do things in Myanmar. And this is actually the subject of a follow-up trip that I had. So I went for that 2-week period initially under this first particular scheme. And then the head of physics from Yangon came to ANU for 2 weeks, and I thought it was a very useful series of conversations we had. And back then, I had a connection with the University and Graduate House. They had a program. Peter Kanowski, the master of the house, established this program to connect the students living in the halls with academics. And I was one of the early people that got brought onto that program. And in the early stages, and through that, met an academic called Margaret Kiley, who had connections in Myanmar. And we had other conversations with another academic called Charlotte Galloway, who was in the College of Asia Pacific as well. They had deep expertise in Myanmar. I'd been there for 5 minutes, right?
Yeah.
But these were people who had been there multiple times across many, many years. And we said one day, wouldn't it be great if we were able to pull together something that really combined the different perspectives that they had as researchers in the humanities with my background in science, and we could get together with all these academics from Myanmar and talk about things like curriculum design and student supervision. And I think this was probably the thing that potentially had greatest impact, because when I was going across before, yes, I stood up and I was giving some lectures and I was talking to individuals, and I'm sure the people in the room benefited at the time. But when we came back for these follow-up workshops a couple of years later, we were delivering them to different groups. There were about 100 academics in total across the 2 or 3 days that we were running these workshops, and really getting to the bottom of ideas about simple things. Yeah, said sarcastically. How do you design a research project? And the thought patterns that they were going through compared to the thought patterns that I would typically go through in design a project, and that I think the student first approach that we take in Australia a lot is more, you've got ideas about what research you want to pursue, but to achieve the best outcomes, you want to match a project with a student, not just in terms of their raw skills, but the things that they're interested in, the things that you think that they maybe don't necessarily have the skills or training in now, but would be really excited about upskilling in that particular area to meet the needs of a particular project. Where the initial approach from the academics from Myanmar was again, brings in the hierarchy. It was very much this is what the project looks like. These are the steps a student's going to do. And there's very little wiggle room around that.
So the interest in nuclear physics education connected with materials, that's sort of driven from the top down. So the interest of the head of department, for instance, was quite important for this connection. So what you see is that the people in those positions tend to be the ones who have gone and have completed PhDs at international universities and have maybe done a postdoc at a national lab overseas or something like that. And so they've got that
perspective that many of the people who have been trained locally and who stay locally don't. The goals that are set for a department are set by the head, and this is what most of the research kind of falls in line with that overall strategy.
Okay. Were there any other kind of differences in how you approached education, research design, et cetera, that kind of surprised you? Anything that stuck in your mind?
Surprises many. Things that stuck in my mind. I think I became very conscious of the way that I speak, not just because of strange accents in foreign lands, which I've been accustomed to, but just that a lot of the jargon and the ways that I casually talk about nuclear physics with my colleagues doesn't necessarily translate immediately into a classroom in a completely different country where English isn't the main language. The education system was very much set up as what you would maybe imagine education used to be like in Australia, in the UK, the places where I've studied, where you have somebody. Certainly, the undergraduate classrooms that I was in 15 years ago, where somebody just stood at the front of the classroom and just wrote on a chalkboard for an hour, and you just wrote down everything that person wrote on the chalkboard.
You're bringing back memories. It's all good.
I think from a couple of lectures that I had a sneak peek in was literally somebody stood at a lectern with a textbook, reading from the textbook. Right. So I think in going there and introducing PowerPoint slides to start with, but also that notion of trying to break up a lecture into smaller segments and then throwing a question to the audience. Say, okay, here's this problem. Take a few minutes, talk to your neighbor, talk to the people behind you because they're sitting in these tiered seats, and see what you come up with. And the first reaction there is that just rabbit in the headlights, deer in the headlights thing, just freezing, not knowing how to react to that because it was so far outside the box from what they'd been used to. I mean, here in physics, we've gone completely the opposite direction, where many of the classes are delivered purely by videos now that students watch in advance and then turn up to a workshop that's all about that student engagement and working through problems. And so having conversations with the academic staff about those different ways that you can communicate that those concepts that the students are still getting the concepts, but thinking more about how do I put this into practice rather than just going through those rote learn phrases and definitions that, as you say, as we've been talking, is digging up memories of undergrad, high school for me about the ways that we used to be taught.
Are there any moments that stood out to you from your work, either with Myanmar or Cambodia, that just seemed poignant, that seemed to sit at the front of your mind when we were discussing these kinds of experiences?
Oh, look, the first thing that springs to mind when you ask that question is purely about the people and the color. And everybody comes to work in Australia and is wearing jeans or some sort of dark colored pants,
like we are now.
Exactly like we are now. But the vibrant colors in the not quite uniforms, but the dress that the academic staff wore, and just that hospitality, like that's something that will stay with me forever. It's just how appreciated and valued that I felt when I was there. Really, yeah. And I've been a few places off the beaten track during my life, and yeah, this was something, like I say, will stay with me forever. The random drive that the head of the department picked four of her staff and basically told. I didn't realize at the time, but she basically told them to look after me for the weekend. And there was a site that was about an hour and a half drive out of the city. There's the history with Myanmar and Britain. There was a site that had some British connection, and once she figured out that I wasn't Australian, that I'm actually Northern Irish and have these British connections, she told her staff to drive this hour and a half. They're like, he must see this. There's this British connection. And, and it was a really lovely drive out. I got to see all these parts of the town that I would never have just gone off and explored myself. And, but being able to spend that hour and a half in the car out there and back again, just chatting with these people and learning about their lives and what it was like to live and work there were really, really valuable experiences for me. So I said it was challenging to come back from and feel the frustration of the enthusiasm at the time. And at that time, and again, very, very different environment. We had a very different financial situation at the university. There was funding available to support initiatives like this.
You're talking about the ANU.
Talking about the ANU, yeah. And then, we went through everything associated with COVID, and then the university changed in terms of the small pots of strategic fundings that can support initiatives like this. So from a funding perspective, even if we had all the will in the world, you need to be able to support these kinds of initiatives.
Yeah.
We had follow-up emails, but again, nothing really happened. We had a very difficult political situation in Myanmar, which again adds more challenges to things. So I think it was a little bit frustrating at the time, having done the work to establish the connections, and then to see it just kind of all grind to a halt was a little bit disappointing. But I do, you look back on it, and there are a lot of very positive memories for me, but also I think a lot of positive influence that we had on myself and my colleagues, say, especially around that second trip out there, in working with those staff who hopefully were able to take on ideas and then go and work with other more junior staff and students and so on and so forth. But I think it's something that I see a lot of value in.
Given Australia is in the process of at least considering growing its involvement in nuclear technologies, are there things we should be thinking about with regards to activities like this that would be important to not just keep up, but maybe grow?
Oh, absolutely. I would very strongly support any initiative like that. I think if we look at Australia and where we sit in the world, the Asia-Pacific region is vast. There are a very large number of people living in that region, but it's the part of the world that we sit in. It's a part of the world that we see a lot of rapid growth in terms of nuclear technology, or attempts to adopt different types of nuclear technology. So I think given where we are in terms of our capability around that area, even if we don't quite have the capacity with some of our other partners in other parts of the world, I think doing what we can to strengthen the overall baseline knowledge in nuclear science across the Asia Pacific, I think greatly benefits Australia.
In what ways is it important for us to do this? Like, what does this kind of nuclear education initiative support?
If we're in a healthy and happy region, then that's obviously to Australia's benefit. But I think as well, as we know, particularly with the nuclear energy, there's potential for things to go wrong. And if we're being serious about being good neighbours and wanting to be in a safe, stable region, if anything that we can do to help uplift that capability in those countries around us, I think, again, feeds into that.
Yeah.
If we're thinking about how do we keep ourselves safe, making sure that our neighbours know what they're doing, I think is an important role that we can play there.
Yeah. So there is a direct link between nuclear education and the support of safety, security, and safeguards with regards to nuclear energy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And of course, they don't stay within national boundaries.
No, not at all.
As we have all learned over time. Is there anything else you might like to share with our listeners about your experience?
Look, I come back again to one of the earliest points about capitalizing on opportunities and being outward thinking. And, I look back over these last 10 years that I've been working at ANU, the few years in the US and the UK before that. What are the highlights? What are the standout things? If I had to pick, write down that list of 5 things on, life achievements, that work with Myanmar is one of the first things that jumps out as a highlight. And so as a person, as a human being, as a professional, the growth opportunities that I've had just by saying yes to that initial opportunity, replying to that email that normally would have gone in the bin. Don't just look by those opportunities. But again, that message goes to the individual who's thinking about the opportunities, but also to, people who are responsible for budgets, who are responsible for ongoing strategy development for particular areas, having a broader strategic vision that captures from Australia, from that Asia Pacific region. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. So if somebody comes and knocks on your door with a crazy idea, don't necessarily just write it off. Maybe hear them out.
Yep. And for you personally, did it change anything about your outlook? Or
I think it did. It definitely taught me, things that at the time I didn't appreciate quite so much, like AV devices not working in teaching rooms, and being able to just take a step back and be like, all right, this isn't working. Let's not focus on that. What can I do differently? How can I fix it? Okay, I can't fix it. What can I do differently to still get that class delivered? And yeah, it was a real extreme experience in education crisis management, if that's the way that you potentially put a label on that. So I think, and that's something that that carries through in my work to this day.
Nuclear Matters is a production of the Australian National University College of Systems and Society. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which this podcast is being recorded on or listened to, and pay our respects to their elders and all First Nations people. If you liked what you heard today, please share this episode with friends, family, and colleagues. If you want to send us some feedback on an episode, please email us at nuclearmatterspodcast@anu.edu.au. Keep in mind that this podcast is intended for information and education only. The views and opinions expressed in each episode are those of the individual speakers and do not represent the official policy or position of the Australian National University College of Systems and Society or the university as a whole.